It's my honor and privilege to live and work in Occoquan, Ani. I thank our hosts, Occoquan, Ani, people, and I hope that I am a good guest, just like the others who work here at the Andrew P. Kashaveroff building. It is my great pleasure to introduce David Rosenthal tonight to you all. I've been lucky to be on staff here at the museum long enough to remember David Rosenthal's entry into an all-Alaska juried art exhibition years and years ago. I was a fledgling security and visitor services person here at the time, free to roam about the galleries and call it work. And I spent hours in that gallery looking at that one painting. It was riveting. And I've been lucky enough to be on staff long enough to offer introductory remarks the last time that David Rosenthal had a solo exhibition at the old Alaska State Museum on this footprint back in 2012. His accompanying lecture for that exhibit blew my mind with what he had to say about the physics, optics, and neuroscience of how the human eye processes seeing paintings. And I hope he will offer some of that STEMmy sort of mind-boggling science magic regarding the human visual system here tonight. Originally from Maine, David Rosenthal studied physics at the University of Maine at Farmington, and after graduation moved up to Cordova, Alaska to work in the fishing industry. This move began a pattern of accepting jobs where he could live and work within interesting milieus, which continues to this day. David Rosenthal has traveled throughout Alaska by working in the fishing industry and also as a participant in the Alaska Artist in the Schools program. Also, as part of the United States Coast Guard art program, he traveled on various icebreakers into the Arctic and to the polar ice cap, and on a shipping and resupply mission for the Thule Air Base in Greenland in 1989. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so you'll have to correct me in your lecture.
I don't know if anybody does. I've always called it Thule, but
Thule.
I don't know if that's right either. So
I bet it's a lot closer than mine. After that, he was invited to continue on with the Icebreakers mission, transiting the Northwest Passage back to Alaska. What an amazing thing. In 1989, Rosenthal began working for the United States Antarctic program. Over the next 10 years, he then spent 2 austral winters and 5 austral summers working for the National Science Foundation as a contractor there in Antarctica. Additionally, he spent 2 austral winters and a summer as a participant in the United States Antarctic Artists and Writers program. More recently, in 2004, he spent 3 months on the Greenland ice cap as a science technician. He's continued to travel to various locations in the higher latitudes while maintaining a home and a studio in Cordova, Alaska. And if you are ever in Cordova, you should call him up, looking him up in the phone book, because he will invite you over to his apartment to look at some of his paintings. One of my favorite labels in this current exhibit that David has here at the Alaska State Museum is the artist talking about how he works. Like writers who have been asked countless times whether they write longhand or use a computer or a pencil, you can tell that David has fielded these questions before, and just a slight hint of pride comes through in the label. He says, and I quote, "I can draw with a heavy glove on. So I can draw in any of the coldest conditions. I can also draw whole scenes from the middle seat of a helicopter through scratched up plexiglass, or when standing on the open cargo ramp of a C-130A flying at 10,000 feet. Remarkable. All of this being said, Rosenthal has painted glaciers for the last 48 years. From Antarctica to the Arctic, his work chronicles the retreats of glaciers and sea ice. His solo exhibition Here Now documents the effects of climate change within the course of his lifetime. And for this exhibition, he worked with a group of scientists from all around the world to create interpretive panels that speak to this. Please join me in offering a warm welcome this evening to one of the most exceptional artists in Alaska, David Rosenthal.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and it was fun listening to it. You'll hear more about it because I will be talking about myself. I'm an artist and I have a big ego, so you'll hear more about me. But mainly this talk is about this exhibit, which is, it's gone beyond being just a solo exhibit. It's what I call a science and art exhibit that uses my paintings as both illustration and as a way to attract attention. And I didn't plan it this way. It just, over the years, it happened. And about 5 years ago, I kind of looked back and I realized that I have a tremendous record of watching the glaciers retreat. I mean, living in Cordova, we're in the middle of the remains of the Cordilleran ice sheet, and you know, it's supported by the Wrangell St. Elias and the Chugach Mountains and even the Alaska Range. That's where there used to be just a chunk of the Cordilleran ice sheet. And I got to see it retreat. And you'll see in the show, of course, many examples of this. And, you know, I lived there. I mean, that was like, I would be out at those glaciers, you know, 50, 100 times a year, and to look at them and watch, or ice skate on the lake in front of them and so on. So this show is kind of, it kind of evolved, and this is the latest iteration of it, and I hope that it travels for a long time, even beyond me, because I think it's a good educational tool to show people what's really going on. And I present it as, I'm a witness to this. I'm not trying to preach, because truth be known, I used a lot of fossil fuels in my travels. I mean, if you, that's just the way it is. I'm as responsible as anybody else. But I want to present it in a way that people understand and hopefully learn some lessons from it. So first, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my history and why it matters to this show. In particular, you know, why would an artist like myself decide, oh, I can do a global warming show, you know, with science in it? And I'm going to explain that with a little bit of history, some of which you just heard. And then I want to talk about the show and some specific examples of these retreats and some other aspects of, you know, global warming, because that's, you know, the bottom line. I mean, I didn't intend for it to be, but you can't watch glaciers retreat without realizing and thinking about global warming. So we'll start the slideshow here. You'll have to, like I say, bear with me. I'm out of practice, so. And is that too much light on the rest of the room, or? It's all right, you can see it, see everything? Okay. All right, I'd just like to point out that right up, whoops, wrong button. There's a laser pointer here someplace. There it is. So this is where Cordova is, where during the Ice Age maximum, and this is the Cordilleran ice sheet. And I just happened to grow up in Maine, which was back then covered by glacier. And so when I was growing up, the Ice Age was long gone, but we would hear about it all the time as kids. You know, look at the rocks in the field, those were left by the glaciers. And, you know, look at the coast, it was carved by the glaciers. And so I actually was pretty fascinated by glaciers even before I got to ever see one. And then in 1977, I got a job in a cannery up in Cordova, and discovered that I was in the middle of the remnants of it. And in more recent years, I started thinking about it as, Well, the Ice Age isn't really ended. Sure, in Maine it's done, but there's remnants of it all over the world, in Antarctica, Greenland, and that particular section of the Alaskan coast. And see, there's Cordova under there. And so at any rate, I started coming up here just to work in the cannery in Cordova. And at the same time, I'd already been painting in Maine. And when I painted in Maine, what I did is I just used to look at different scenes in Maine, and I would say, you know, oh, that's nice, and I'd take that, and then something else, and I'd take that and add it to it, and I'd create a scene that was not a real scene, but people would come up to me and say, well, how'd you get in my backyard, or, you know, or that's my favorite place. And but you could get away with that in Maine because everything's kind of fuzzy with brush and short sight lines, and there aren't a whole lot of distinctive landmarks in Maine. So these paintings, they really had no, they're representational, but you know, if you look at this, you can't even tell if there's any perspective being used in it, and so things were kind of floating. But they were colorful, and I still like this old painting. That's why I keep it around, and I show it to people. And then this is another one of these Maine paintings. This scene doesn't exist, but it's fairly plausible because it's Maine. And this is where I first started to fool around with water and try and create realistic water and other things. And once again, you can see I'm kind of trying to figure out things as I go along. And here's some of those boulders in the field from the glaciers. But like I say, these weren't meant to be that real. They were just out of my head. And but then I came to Cordova, and this is probably the first oil painting I did in Cordova. And it's out from the back of the cannery looking across to Hawkins Island, an island right across Ork Inlet. And I used my same method of I looked at this and I went home and after work, and I painted it from memory. And this is truly not a realistic painting. It's not a bad painting, but it's not realistic. And then, of course, I started to work in Alaska more. And Denali is Denali. You can't just go, there's no way I can remember everything. I don't have a photographic memory. I have a pretty good memory, but basically, if I wanted to paint Denali so it looks like Denali, I had to get more information. And that's when one of the biggest things to occur in my time as an artist was when I started to draw the landscape first. And from that point on, this painting was done recently, but back in about 1978 or so, I started to draw things first. And that made a huge difference in my work. It made a huge difference in my understanding of nature and so on. So that's what I do to this day. And here's another example of, I couldn't go up there and just remember this. I mean, it's just not possible. And so what I did do is, this was one of the first Percent for Art commissions I ever did for the city of Anchorage. And I must have hiked up there 7 times. And a couple of those times I went to hike up there to look at this, and the clouds came in. And it's a long hike, and I was kind of regretting my choice of work. But I'll point out in this, that's shared, whoops, sorry about that. That's Sheridan Glacier right there. And this was probably, like I say, maybe 82 or something. And now the end of Sheridan Glacier is over here, but it's not visible because the ice is that much thinned. And so basically, when you were here, you were probably 600-800 feet above the lake, and this whole area here was probably something like 10 square miles. And in 2019, it floated away because it started to float. It had been ablating on top and less weight on the glacier. Finally, it floated, and as soon as the glacier floats, the ice starts to just break into pieces, and it floated away. And it did it in one season, and there's actually a kind of a sequence of photos out there. All right, so I like to put these in here because this shows another change in my work. Notice that the snow was very, I did draw this first, but look how the snow is kind of amorphous. There's no shape to it. And it was one night I discovered mediums to dilute my paint and to be able to blend it and so on. And so the next painting I did after this was another moonlit mist one. But see how you can see the snow surface and goes off into the distance. And that's because I started to use mediums. So that was a major, I taught myself to paint by these little accidents. And this is one of my favorite old paintings from then. But once again, you can see how the snow has a form to it. It's not just white and as well as there's a lot more detail in the grasses and so on. Because when you add mediums, you can do a lot more detail. Painting with paint straight out of the tube like I used to in Maine was kind of like plowing snow with your brush, you leave these big lines. And this is Teneke Inlet on my first Artist in the School residence. And I point this out because this is the water here, you could actually see into it, into the bottom below the waves, the rocks and so on. And I must have used probably 15 layers of glaze. I would just glaze it, and then I'd rework it with adding pigment, then I'd glaze it again when it dried and so on, until I started I'd emphasize the parts that I wanted until I got a good, feeling for this transparency of the water. And then this is my best painting, 1986. So I've been going downhill for a long time. But at any rate, this painting, easily 20 or more layers of transparent glazes to get that effect of looking into the water and seeing the refracted light on the rocks, the refracted sunlight, as well as seeing reflections on the surface of the water. And I always point out that anybody who photographs this scene, what they get is they get kind of a orangish glow by the shore. It just doesn't, you can either focus on the reflections on top or you can focus on the bottom. And so a camera can't do what I can do, which is to do both at once and change my view. And then this painting was bought out of the All Alaska show the second time I was in it. And it should be here someplace in the collection. But this was another one. You can see the water, this transparency of water fascinated me, and Crater Lake was just a great subject. Now, the reason I show these is I kind of like to prove my ability as a realist painter, because a lot of the paintings in the show, and some of them are just paintings that I did because it's something I normally do, where I find something beautiful and I paint them. And some of those are in the show. But then there's a lot of paintings that are illustrations, where I paint it as I remember it from years before, and then paint it as it might have been even further back, or paint it as it is now, and so on. And when I do that, those are artist recreations. And a lot of us think of artist recreations as kind of fuzzy, not very, very realistic and not very convincing. But I like to point out, because I'm such a realist painter, and I maintain that since I only work from from drawings, not photos, and memory and experience, what you're seeing is more real than a photo. It's not more accurate. If you took a photo of that scene, it wouldn't be exactly the same. But to a human, our perception, it appears more real. It feels more real because you're seeing what I actually see in my head, not the way the camera records it. And I certainly would not want to, I could go on for hours. I won't, despite what Mary said about adding a lot of this information. I won't go on for hours, but there are so many differences, as I've learned over the years, between the way we see things and the way the camera records them. So that's my proof that I can do this. And here's another example. This is also in there because this is from an artist in the school residency in 1986 in Breivik Mission. And I put a number of these in there, Western Alaska, into the show. These were just done, as artwork. But I put a number of these examples in the show because when I started doing this show and I started looking at the Northwest Passage and the concept of the Ice Age where there was Beringia, well, a lot of the Beringia coast, which Beringia, as it turns out, is, it's like a continent practically. And it would have been fairly similar to our Western Alaska in the Ice Age because it was so cold and dry that you wouldn't get accumulating glaciers and you would have wind blowing the snow and so on. So this is kind of like what it would have looked like in a huge area in what is now referred to as Beringia. This is up in the Brooks Range from another artist in the school residency up at Anaktuvik Pass, and you can see out towards the North Slope. And these are the Brooks Range Mountains, which I point out, they're not heavily glaciated. We think, wow, they're so far north, you'd think they'd have all kinds of glaciers. But they don't get the precipitation the coastal areas get. And so the glaciers, they don't build up. There's a few, I guess, up there, but not in this particular area. And then this is what Mary had mentioned about being on the back of a C-130 on the cargo ramp. They put it down. It was in Antarctica, and I got to go on what they called a recce flight, and so they put the cargo ramp down and they let everybody take a turn with what they called a gunner's belt, where you strap in and then you could walk out on the back of the thing, and then you had all of Antarctica just in front of you. It was like being in it was just amazing. And then what happened here was that the airplane just started to make a turn just as I was getting on the ramp, and it started to fly away from this mountain, and it perfectly framed the mountain just as you see it in this painting. And I just did some drawings of it real quick, and because we were flying away, there was no angle change, and so it was really easy to draw it, and it's become one of my favorite paintings. I call this my archetypal painting because if I tell kids and artists in the schools or wherever to draw a mountain, this is what they draw, big triangle, and so, and so then after a lot of artists in the schools travel, which it was just an incredible program. It was great for me. But the U.S. Coast Guard has a program, and you can apply and become a U.S. Coast Guard artist, and they let me travel on the Northwind on its last voyage. It was the last of the wind class icebreakers, and they were escorting a research ship into the ice cap, and we got almost to 83 degrees north. And at the time, that was the third furthest north any ship had been. This was in about 88, I think. And the Russians had taken a nuclear-powered icebreaker up to the North Pole, and they had taken, the Germans had their polar Bjorn, I think it is, polar stern had gone to 97 degrees. So this was only the third furthest. But even with the Polar Star, which was a 399-foot icebreaker with, I forget, it was the most powerful non-nuclear icebreaker, it was hard to break the ice because most of the ice cap was like third, fourth, 10-year ice. And the ice the salt drains out of the ice. It becomes more like freshwater ice, which is much harder. And it takes a lot, even out of a icebreaker like Polar Star, to break that kind of ice. So we couldn't go further. That's as far as we could go. And talking about now, they come and go to the North Pole all the time. And in fact, a couple years back, I remember hearing in the winter that there was open water at the North Pole and it was 50 degrees. And so, the ice cap, and this is one of the tipping points that we're going to be reaching. They're estimating now, or some of the estimates I heard, I should say, are that it's going to be 2030, there might not be any ice in the summer left, which means all the ice in the winter will be just 1 year ice, and it will melt even faster. And the more that you melt the ice, the less reflective ice there is, the faster the Arctic Ocean absorbs heat. And so this is one of these tipping points that I like to point out. And then this is an Antarctic glacier, and this is another example of Antarctica, 99%, I should just be showing you white on white. But there's these areas, this is called the Taylor Valley. It's part of what's called the dry valleys. And even in the Ice Age, these were probably clear of snow and ice. They're very cold. I heard statistics, I don't believe them anymore, that it hadn't rained for thousands of years in these valleys. It was always too cold, even in the summer. And I saw it rain a couple times, so that wasn't quite right. But the basic idea is that even though it's so cold, there just isn't much precipitation, and the air is so dry that there was one time I saw a snowstorm where we got a foot of snow, which was really unusual. And over the course of the day, you could watch it just sublimate. It didn't melt, it just went into the air because it's somewhere around 1 or 2% humidity down there in the winter. And so this, as you can tell, this whole idea of glaciers, what makes them, is fascinating to me. So I'm showing you this, That's what you came for, so that's what you're getting, Then I was a science tech up on the Greenland ice cap, working with some of the same people I worked with in Antarctica in 2004. And we were up there monitoring all this equipment, and Summit Camp was one of the high points. There's 2 high points on the ice cap in Greenland, and Summit was at 10,600 feet up. And it's just like an ocean of ice. And most of my paintings from up there are just about the sky with the with the ice down below, or the snow-covered ice. But when I was there in 2004, I was told that there is no melting at that altitude on that ice cap because it's just too cold even in the summer. You might get in a corner of a building where the sunlight's hitting it direct, you might get a little bit of melting, but everything else just stays fresh snow. But now, of course, they've had, many melting events. It happens all the time. And also in 2006, I was shown a map of Greenland, and there was it was where the melting reached at that time in 2004. And it only reached to about to right around 6,000 feet. anything above that, it didn't melt. But below, they started to have melting. And they had some camps that were literally buried in ice because it was melting for the first time. And so even way up there, there's big changes coming from the global warming. Now, on this icebreaker trip, the second one that I went on was with Polar Star, and we went up to Thule to resupply. We would guide ships through the summer sea ice all along Greenland because it was still thick even in the summer. And then we'd turn around and escort them back out of the ice, and then the oil tanker would come and we'd escort them up and down. But one time we were waiting for one of the ships to unload so we could escort him back, and the captain said, "Oh, let's take the artist up to Davis Strait," you know. I mean, he was just looking for an excuse to have a good time with this ship. And I said, "Yeah, great." And we tried to get up to this Davis Strait, which was in between Ellesmere Island and Greenland. And that's Ellesmere Island there. And you can see that tortured sea ice there. That is just like multi-year ice. And we met that with the big icebreaker, and the captain just said, "Nope, it's not worth the wear and tear on the boat to sightsee, you know, even for me." And so, and I like to point this out because I haven't been back there. I don't know if I'll ever get back there. That was a pretty unique experience. But now I bet you can just sail right through. I mean, if you look at the maps, they say where the sea ice is in the summer, it shows it as kind of ending. And the same was true of the rest of the Northwest Passage. This is just a big berg near Greenland. And this was Greenland, the coast. When I went up to Summit Camp, I was fortunate that we got stuck waiting in Kangerlussuaq for weather up at Summit. And this was in August, and it really is Greenland along this coast. It's just beautiful, you know. And we were able to take and go up this road up towards the ice cap from Kangerlussuaq, and there's beautiful places, and they're just, whoops, sorry. All right, what I meant to do was, you'll notice that, see, here's the ice retreating off of this, and you'll notice right here, it's almost bare gravel with just some vegetation starting. The year before, it was released, you know, so this was released the year before, then 2 years before this was released, and you see how much more vegetation there is. And you could look at all these places and just see this written on the landscape on how the ice is retreating. And so at any rate, and this is the painting that inspired the name of my show, because I painted this originally. This is a reproduction that I painted for the show. It's still an oil painting, but the original I had sold, and I called it The End of the Ice Age. And so years later, when I started developing this show, it just seemed to fit. So, and here's another big iceberg, and now this is going into the Northwest Passage up by Devon Island. It's kind of the opening that most of the travel through the Northwest Passage goes. And you notice this one last big glacier on the side towards Greenland on Devon Island. But once you get into the Northwest Passage, whoops, that's not it, but once you get into it, and you'll see in some of the paintings, it's like desert. It's so dry and it's kind of flat. You know, we think of the Northwest Passage as going to be beautiful fjords like Alaska, but it's so dry, and once again, glaciers weren't created because the ice would have sealed off all the moisture, and as well as the Northwest Passage itself probably might not have even existed because sea levels would have been, so much lower. So it would have just been a kind of flat plain with some little dips in it. But at any rate, that then, of course, in the show, I tried to make it look like you were going from Greenland all the way to Western Alaska, and explain it. So I didn't get this slideshow quite as good as the show. So see the show. Then when I went in 1989, I got a job down in Antarctica at McMurdo Station, and it took me 2 years to get a job, and finally I called this one guy who would later be my boss, and he said, I got one job, and I said, I'll take it. He says it's as a laborer, and I said, I'll take it. And he said, it's for 54 weeks. I said, I'll take it. And at the same time, I had heard about this National Science Foundation Artist and Writers Program. So I applied to that program. And I went and I applied to that program, but I also took the job because I've always felt that you need to be familiar with the place to paint. So I didn't want to go down as the artist and be like, where's the restroom and where's the, the galley and so on. So it really worked out well. It took me 4 applications to get the artist position, but in the meantime, I ended up in science support working at this Berg Field Center where I got to go out with scientists and it worked out great because when I did get the position, I knew all the scientists. They would tell me, yeah, you got to go here, go to the Beacon Valley, go to the Arenas Valley, and and my old boss, when I showed up, she's like, where all the equipment is, go get what you want. So I'd get the best feathered friends sleeping bags. And see, McMurdo, you have a lot of different types of ice, and sorry about that again. This here, see these rolls? That's the ice shelf pressure ridges. So the ice shelf, this is a McMurdo ice shelf, and who knows, it's probably 100 feet thick. And then it's under all this pressure from massive sheets of ice pushing down on it. So when it comes up against the land, which is over here, it forms these pressure ridges, just like sea ice pressure ridges, but much, much bigger. And some of these ripples can be, hundreds of yards across. But then you have the annual sea ice, which is breaking up here at the end of the season. And you've got shorefast ice here. And then, of course, all the mountains, every surface in Antarctica, in McMurdo anyways, in that area, if it was flat, it would get glaciated because there wasn't a whole lot of precipitation, but it never melted, pretty much. Nowadays, it does start to melt a little bit. So everything's glaciated. And there's Mount Erebus, and it's just totally glaciated. It's an 11,000 or 12,500 foot volcano. You can see a little steam coming out of it. And then you can see some more of this, some more of the pressure ridges where it kind of breaks the ice up. And that's the southernmost water in the world, open water. Open ocean water, I should say. Then this was over in Palmer Station, and this was a view from up on a glacier about 300 feet up. And now when you go to Palmer Station, I've seen pictures of it, this is all gone. This is an island, and that's gone, and there's just a little bit of ice on this island. And that was from 99 to now, so, it's melting. So, and this is just a large iceberg down there. You've probably heard of these tabular bergs that break off. Sometimes they're hundreds of miles long, or size of the state of Connecticut. Well, when I was there at Palmer Station, I got to go out with these scientists who were collecting ice fish, various types of fish that have antifreeze in their veins, and we went out there, and this particular berg is a small piece off of a 40-mile berg that drifted through this channel, and every now and then it would bump on the bottom and break off another one of these, and there was about 30 of these things just in a line. It's just amazing how huge. It's about a 300-foot berg. And then this is looking kind of to the back of behind Palmer Station, and that berg was about a 300-foot berg, and this is in the winter, and the sun for a while doesn't hit Palmer directly, but the surrounding mountains pick it up a little, and some places on the ocean do. And just 2 days before I left, I went back up here, and that big berg had just disintegrated, just, fell apart. All right, so now this is more about the show. That's enough about me and my work. So I started to notice, and in particular, I noticed this change. You see the middle painting. That's what Childs Glacier looked like in 1977. And everybody in town back in 1977 would go and drive out and just spend time watching it calve into the ocean. And it was really a spectacular sight. And then I went out there in 2019, and this that's what it looked like. It barely reached the Copper River. For I don't know, centuries it had been in equilibrium where it would push ice into the river as fast as the ice would wash it away in the summer. And it finally reached the point where not enough ice was being pushed. And then I realized, well, wait a second, I can go back in time as an artist. It's pretty hard to go back and photograph, but I could recreate. And since I'm a realist and I have a science background, I created what it might have looked like from different historical accounts in maybe before 1800 or something, where Miles Glacier came out almost meeting Childs Glacier. And this is what started me thinking about this show, because I realized I can chronicle a lot of things like this. And so here's a close-up of those same paintings. And it was one of the wonders of the world. And we had it, you'd go out there some summer days and you'd be the only one sitting watching this thing. It was just, we didn't know what we had. And then here's my recreation, which I point out as a scientist. You'll notice that if you looked at the other paintings, you saw much less of the mountains or you saw much more of the mountains in the other paintings, because in fact, not only is it shortening, but it's thinning tremendously. Maybe from 77, it might have thinned by 1,000 feet back up in there. So then on the other side, looking the other direction on the Copper River, you have Miles Lake, and that's Miles Glacier. And this was the same trip in 2019, I think it was, and that's Miles Glacier. And actually, if you went up close to it in the year 1990, you would have seen it had an active face, but that's gone now. But we missed I had a recreation of what Lieutenant Allen saw, where it was that whole lake was filled with ice hundreds of feet high and thick, and there was just a little stream of the copper, in front of it. But this is an art painting, you might call it, and it's just looking up to Miles Lake, and there's that active face over to one side. And this is looking at Childs from down below the bridge, and it was just immense. You couldn't really get a handle on how big it was. And then, of course, Columbia Glacier is one of the poster childs for global warming. And so in 2011, I was able to go out there, and it had already retreated about 12 miles. And then I went back out, and 10 years later, that same scene was now open water, and you can just see one of the glaciers, one of the branches rather, coming out from the side. See, so that glacier that's coming down in the back, it's coming down and reaching the water there. It doesn't spread out, and so the Columbia Glacier is now 7 glaciers. And so this is probably the most dramatic. Look for it in the show, because this is 2011 and this is 2022. And you see that ridge goes down to the water, and the glacier barely makes it to the water, and that's 5 miles away. And so once again, in comparison, thousands of feet of ice and 5 miles in distance gone in 10 years. And then I put this one in here because this shows my dilemma as a realist painter. This is Saddlebag Glacier. And when my first winter in Cordova in 1981, you used to follow the stream and you'd hike around, and you come around a corner and there's the glacier filling this canyon. And it was just spectacular. And it's always been burned into my memory. And it had a real green color, which took me a while to figure out. I thought, well, it must be copper salts in it or something. Turns out this was at the solstice, and this canyon faced directly south. And even at the solstice, the sun is low enough at noon to be kind of yellowish. So it would mix with the the blue, and you get this incredible green. And but my dilemma became when the last time I went out there was actually when I did the drawing for this. A beautiful winter day, just spectacular, really cold but windy and just so brilliant. And I went home and I started to do the painting, and it came time to do no glacier going up you'll see an example in the show, just no glacier. And I was like, well, what should I do? Should I follow the memory that I have burned into my head for 40 plus years, or should I take the memory that's 5 hours old? And I decided, okay, I'm going with what I really remember, and so what? Who cares about realism? I can use my artist license to recreate what I kind of felt about it. So, and then this is Sheridan Glacier in 2012, 10 years ago. See the same mountain in the distance. That whole thing had gone in just that short time, 10 years. And then I just did this one because I just love the idea of the Ice Age. And this is a place that we would hike up and ski in the summer. And behind me in this view was big, wide corn snow fields for skiing. But I used to always think about, you'd look at the terrain and you'd realize that the glaciers covered this whole area to about 2,000 or more feet. So in the Ice Age, that same scene would have looked like this. And here's Mount Stellar, and you'll notice this little line, that's the front of the glacier. It's only about 10, 20 feet high, but that glacier extends, it's about 30 miles to the Mount Stellar back there. It's all foreshortened. And the glacier is the size of Rhode Island by various estimates. And this would actually be looking at right angles to that last one. You can see the glacier continuing, and this is Vetus Lake. And I like to point this one out because there's a science panel that describes how Bering Glacier surged in the 90s. And the surge was not because all of a sudden global warming was retreating or global warming was ending. It surged because of conditions in the glacier bed. They figure a lot more meltwater kind of lifted hydraulically the glacier bed, so it slid more. And so in a short time, it advanced, I forget, something like 5 miles into the lake. They were worried it was going to go right out into the Gulf of Alaska and start sending icebergs all over. It never did that, but I have a panel in there from Jay Fleischer, who worked there for many years as a scientist and describing that surge, because part of this show I wanted to educate people on this idea that, just because you hear about a glacier advancing someplace doesn't mean that disproves all the thousands of glaciers retreating, that there's no global warming. So, and then of course high mountain glaciers. I tried climbing Denali. I got altitude sickness and at 16,000 feet, but I like to use these as examples of these high mountain glaciers, which probably won't change much for many years because they're so high up there. This is all the Kahiltna Glacier. That was Mount Hunter, and this is Mount Foraker. And then this is a painting I did of Goodwin Glacier. When I first got to Cordova, you'd drive out the road to the big glacier, but you'd see this little tongue of a glacier, and it glowed blue in this little valley. And within 20 years, you couldn't see it anymore. And then I had that painting, and that painting actually got destroyed, and I didn't have any photographic record of it. So I decided this year I'm painting that Goodwin Glacier again to have for myself. And so, and then this is the last. This is Mendenhall, and these are the only I use photographs on some of the other illustrations, but in my normal work, I only work from drawings and memory and experience. But in this case, I wanted to have the Mendenhall ones for this show for obvious reasons. It's, in Juneau. And plus, we had that outbreak, which was, got a lot of notice, is about the best thing I can say about it. But at any rate, I did this from a photo that Jackie Manning took recently out at there. And then I tried to remember back from when I was here, I think the first time, and saw Mendenhall sometime in the early 80s. And so I went searching for historical photos that kind of matched that memory. And this is what I came up with. And it's not totally accurate, but then again, glaciers change, who's going to say, so, but, and that's it. But, and that's just about, well, that's actually more than 40. Well, no, there was the introduction, took time. So at any rate, do we got a few minutes for questions, or does the museum have to close up?
Anybody has a question? I've got the microphone here. Oh.
I was wondering, how do you cope with this loss of ice? And you're so intimately involved, and you're a scientist, and you're always around scientists. And, emotionally, personally, I was just wondering how you cope with it.
Well, to tell you the truth, it seriously is sad. But I always think about, yes, for me, it's a personal tragedy. But when you consider the millions or billions of people that are going to be affected by this global warming, my problems are pretty minor. But I do have to say, one of the most depressing things about this show is when I show it to young people in Cordova, and they see what we used to go and do, and it's just sad because they're not going to get to see this. I was just so fortunate. So I mean, I cope with it, and there still is ice, and there's still, still more glaciers for me to find, and more glacial landscapes. We still go out, and Sheridan just made a huge lake, so now we got more room to skate and look at icebergs. And so for me, it's not that big a deal. But when I think about all these young people, and it is kind of a big deal. So.
You mentioned that you do a lot of sketches from various locations. Do you do like little watercolor sketches to capture the color, or is that all in your head?
Well, my drawing sketches have occasional color notes, and and things like, if you know the time of day, if it's, let's say, sunset, the color graduation from the horizon opposite the sun up, and then towards the sun and up. There's things that from experience you learn. But occasionally I'll run into something where there are a lot of colors, let's say in the rocks, that are different, and I'll put a little color note. But when I started those icebreaker trips, I started doing watercolor studies. And over the years, but I can't do them out where I, draw with overmitts. And what I do is, people ask me, well, why don't your watercolors freeze? And I say, well, because I go and sit in a warm room, and I take my drawings in the book with the occasional color note, but mainly the drawings give me the structure of the scene, and I remember colors real well. But I literally have done 4,000 or 5,000 of these little watercolor studies over the years. And then I would, like in an Antarctic season, I would do 500, and I'd get home and I'd go through them and I'd say, oh, yeah, this might be a good full-size one. This one, and that's how I pick them. When I first started painting, before doing studies, I would do a show with 20 paintings, and everybody would like just one of them. And it's because that one was better than the others. And I used to say to myself, I wish I could only do the good ones. And the watercolors kind of helps with that, because I can look at them and get a better idea. So my average now might be 8 out of 20 or something that are really good.
So how long estimate does it take you to do one of these full-size paintings?
Well, see, there are many layers depending on the scene. If it's a water scene, there can be just 20 layers. And so I don't look at it as, and so I work on 20. One time I had 80 paintings going, and so I would work on one, set it aside, work on another, put another layer on. And when you have 80 paintings, that's really depressing, because you work an evening on a painting and you put it aside and you go, oh, 79 to go. And so I never did that again. That was just, but, so some of them take a long time. And so the way I usually look at it is, these full-size paintings, back when that's all I didn't do smaller oil studies, which I've started doing for the last 10, 15 years. Full-size ones, in a good year, I'd do 40, that I'd start to finish. But some of them would have been taking only a month, and some not would take 6 months. Like that painting I mentioned is my favorite painting. That was off and on the wall, which I use for an easel, for a full year. And I entered it in the All Alaska show. And at the same time, I had a painting of water lilies that's at the Anchorage Museum. And so some people might have seen that. That painting was 3 sittings. I called it my magic painting and I've never had an experience like that. It was just like, I glazed the water. I took green paint and started a stem from a leaf going into the water. The glaze pulled the color off until there was almost no color, so it looks like it was sinking, and I just did that to each stem. It was one of the greatest painting experiences of my life. But I put that one in also at the same time with that other painting that took me so long into the All Alaska show, which was what the biennial used to be. So, but I should add the watercolors. I can do those, anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour. And that's why I could do hundreds in an Antarctic season, especially because Antarctica is great for watercolors. It's just all light, and there's no detail like bushes or, so.
I'm just curious what you foresee for your future as an artist. Are you going to continue to follow the glaciers? Are you going to do something else? Just what do you think from here?
Yeah, I'll be doing exactly what I've been doing all these years. One of my other talents is stubbornness. I never listened. I never listened to what people told me I should be doing because they looked at my realistic landscapes, and just said, no one does that anymore. So I did it. And I'll continue to do landscapes, and there is ice left. I mean, that's not really the issue. There's the East Antarctic ice sheet will be there for centuries. It's just some very problematic places where the ice is going so fast that we're going to deal with all these sea level rise and all these feedback, like the permafrost melting and releasing greenhouse gases is really going to be a huge thing. But hopefully there'll be landscape, and I'll continue to paint it as long as I can. So, okay, well, that's. I appreciate you coming. Thanks for coming.